In this video, we are going to reveal how much we understand form in terms of documentation, three-dimensionally and two-dimensionally. As an architect or an educating architect, it's very easy to create a mishmash of forms and call it architecture. There's always a discussion in class if architecture belongs in the art sphere or in the design sphere. Because when you say art, we're talking about expression, whether it's expression of feelings, expression of a literature, and then you translate it into a form. But nobody can object to that. But when it comes to design, we're talking about functionality and measurable standards. So probably architecture belongs in the design sphere. So this is where we are operating at when it comes to gauging if the students is actually understanding their form. In the last video, I mentioned the term Platonic idea. It's the highest form of ideas. And then the opposite of Plato is Aristotle, which refers to matter or physical form. And this is where I want to point out that this exercise is more on the physical form. And when you're dealing with something that is very tangible, you need to recognize its physical properties. So whenever I see a very complex geometry or a very sculptural form, I always wonder the understanding behind it, how the author is able to translate it into something more measurable. You cannot build it if you don't understand it, and you can't understand it unless you draw it. That's why it's very important in this presentation see if they were able to draw it, because that is the only proof that they were able to understand the complexity of their form and they were able to make it real into something measurable and probably eventually something buildable. I've already given the students specifics that this has to be built on a 40 by 40 meter property, and then it really has to have that notion of building, meaning there will be layers of floors and probably walls, etc. The model they will create will reveal how much they understand the project brief in terms of form and design language, and the 2D documentation, on the other hand, will reveal how much they understand their creation. The work is very confident in terms of composition. You can see clearly the folding language, very apparent, the corners are very clear. And what I like about this work is that it tricks the eye as if you see a lot of enclosed volumes. And when you see those enclosed volumes, you think that it's not a continuous material. And to prove that it's actually a continuous envelope, he spread it horizontally, and then you see the cuts of the folds, and I mean the cuts of the cardboard, and he represented it with proper line types such as broken lines, and then of course you have the continuous lines. Again, these lines represent different meanings. In this case, we know that the broken lines meant folding, and he also numbered it accordingly, but in this process it doesn't really matter where we start. What's important is that you know how to clearly instruct the person who's not around the designer how to rebuild the form. So this is a very complete work, but later on you will see that there are more interesting work in terms of providing more information and material. This work is very expressive of the folding language. She didn't hide it. She expressed the profile of the folds, and you can see it from the sides and you can see it from the front. So when it comes to proving that it is actually continuous, even though it's already obvious in the model, what I like about the submission is that it is spread horizontally again, and then he started with a top view, a complete envelope, and then he showed where the cuts were made, and then those cuts are where the folds will happen. And later on you see that the succeeding images will show you the horizontal. Later on you will see that the broken lines that represent the fold is already indicated. But how I wish that he incorporated the numbers so that there's like a chronological order on how to build this, and it's more interesting that way. This is exceptionally complex in terms of form and language. You will seldom see students who will do this because it's very hard to document. And I always tell them that when you want a complex form such as this one, you'll need to be ready to pay the price. And what is that price? You need to be able to draw it individually, all the facets, etc. Although there are softwares that are available now for documenting complex forms, so if you don't have access to this kind of tools, you are forced to do it manually. So, but I admire the students' bravery when it comes to presenting a folding form or a continuous form that is this complex. And so when we're looking at the documentation part, I admire the effort, but the folding idea is not expressed in the documentation. How I wish that it's a growing paper or a reducing paper. In this case, the student segmented the facets. So he introduced a single facet and then the second facet that is added into it, and so on and so forth until he completes the form. Unfortunately, it could have been better if he was able to reveal the origin of this complex form. We are not saying that this process is wrong. It's just that what we are saying is that we want the process to be pushed further so that the intuition of the students in terms of form will be enhanced further. This is a very straightforward work because you can see one page for the model and then one page for the 2D documentation. And what I like about the 2D documentation is that there's a complete information when it comes to the actual form that is almost in an isometric view with a lot of information indicated on it. And then there's also the orthographic drawings, if I may call it that way. But you can see that it's a step-by-step drawing showing where it originated from, and then when you spread it horizontally, you see the cuts and the folds of the form. So for me, this is actually a good 2D documentation. I like the fact that this is not your typical S-profile folding language of a model or architecture because you can see that it tries to be complex by introducing interlocking situations in the model. Unfortunately, when it comes to documentation, we can see segmented parts of the building that doesn't make sense. It makes sense in a way that you know that it was cut into segments probably to represent a certain floor or a certain zone in the building. I think he got it right. It's just that I think he took the easiest way and the most obvious way to do it because I sense that this student is actually very advanced creatively, and you know, when you are in a class and then you sort of know where the class is going to, you sort of somewhat ignore the process and probably take for granted what can be learned in that long tedious process, and I understand that part. And again, this is just an assumption, but I tried to read from the submission, I tried to read from the work because you can really see a work that was devoted with time and effort, and a work that was rushed because anyway it's actually correct, it's actually meeting the project brief. And when you look at the documentation, it's actually very correct. You see the proper line types, and it's very easy to read when you look at its relationship with the model. It's just that it was limited to the outside, to the exterior envelope, when he could have done more. When this exercise is supposed to explore not just the exterior envelope but also the interiority of an architecture or a form. So I would imagine that it would have been more interesting, two-dimensional documentation wise, if he explored the interiors as well when these folds are going inside and out, etc. I think trusting the process is really key in this situation. This is what I meant when it comes to a complete immersion with the process. You can see a complete work down from the model up to the 2D documentation. I put this work in the middle because to point out what the previous project is lacking. You can see from the models, from the documentation, that there's so much effort put into it. I'm not talking about just the presentation style or the presentation skill of the folding. You can see that the student tried to fold it inwardly and then create an overall envelope, etc. And then of course you have the proper documentation of the model, and at the same time the 2D documentation, which reveals the overall form of the continuous sheet or envelope, which is I think very impressive. So I hope the students can keep this kind of work consistently. Just by looking at the first sheet alone, you can already see that the form is already spread out, and you can see the proper line types indicating where the folds happened. And then when you see the model, it's actually an interesting form. Maybe the model can be cleaned up a bit, but I also like the fact that the model looks like an actual building. I think this is a doable form for an actual project. And then when we look at the 2D documentation, instead of using just line types, this is the person who used colors and color coding to indicate which part of the fold is going to fold a certain way. And then he created a table or a catalog of these actions that ends up into the final form. At the start of the video, because I really like the video documentation. Although the form is very sculptural, it's very hard to imagine it as a working building, but it is impressive nonetheless. And then when I'm looking at the documentation, it's actually a combination of segmented parts and then the folded and spread out parts to reveal the actual form of the building, or the actual shape of the continuous envelope, which I think is very good. And the way she documented it, it is as if it's laid out on a poster, which I really like. That makes it very enticing to read and very enticing to see, even display. If you want to, instead of using colors just like the previous work, she used shading to indicate a certain meaning for the step. If you remember my project brief, during the first episode, I was requiring for a more rigid material so that they can simulate the properties of plywood. So when you use a cardboard, you will need to provide scores or light cuts so that you can easily bend it a little. In this case, it wasn't applied, and then probably we can assume that this form will be constructed in concrete. Nothing against when it comes to this form, but for this exercise, I think the reason why we are requiring a certain material, because we want a certain level of challenge. We easily read that the student understands the instruction of the professor, recognize the step-by-step procedure in order to arrive at the final form. It's very easy to see that this student understands the project brief, as you can see with the step-by-step procedure of his 2D documentation. But I find the video of the snake a little too trivial. Maybe he's trying to impress the girls. Form-wise, we know that this student didn't stop on the S-shaped profile like the other students. She tried to create other interesting forms out of the sheet or envelope. And at the same time, she took off from my criticism last week, wherein the other student created negative spaces or voids onto the envelope, and then created windows, a sort of a window for the form, which I think is really commendable. And not to mention that she didn't really break the form when it comes to 2D documentation as seen in this animation, but he has a version of the documentation showing the segmented parts and at the same time the connected parts, revealing the overall form or the overall shape of the envelope. It is also nice that she tries to imagine this as a building by segmenting the floors. Probably she imagines that this floor is going to be a certain program, and then the next floor will be another, so on and so forth. So a good job. The same case as the previous project. Yes, it was able to meet the project brief, the notion of a building with the folding elements, but when it comes to documentation, it's just an addition of segmented parts. So it doesn't really express the idea of continuity when it comes to the documentation. What I'm trying to point out here is that yes, there's the documentation part that is separate from the actual concept, but what if you're able to express the same idea of, in this case, folding with the documentation part as well? I think that will be more impressive, just like the previous work that I showed you in the middle of this video. And but at least what redeemed this project is that we can see that he has a drawing of a spread out continuous envelope in the middle of his presentation, which is really good. And what I also want to encourage the students is that when they are presenting a video to further express their ideas, don't just present a video that sort of shows the 3D, or that the presentation style is relevant to the concept being asked. Because in this case, it's just like a video reveal of the overall form, and that's about it. Unlike the other presentations you saw that it was also folding as they reveal the origin of the form. With the models of material, we can see that the project brief was met, and at the same time, even without using digital tools such as AutoCAD or Illustrator, manually he was able to document it properly, get to know each facet of the form, and then spread it horizontally, number it accordingly. And I think this is an impressive work despite the lack of polish and professional quality of the presentation. Work from last week, again, the notion of building is there, the continuous element is there, but unfortunately I didn't follow the instructions of documenting it in a two-dimensional way. I thought that there are other ways to do it the easiest way, and it's just an assumption though, because you can see where the origin of the form came from, but he missed the opportunity to immerse himself with the form and get to know each facet of the folds. When it comes to architecture and when it comes to building it, you really need to be very knowledgeable of the elements of the building, and he missed that opportunity. And it's the same case with this next work. The form is complex, it took time to make this model, it's very interesting, but there's no drawing. There's no drawing to judge, there's no documentation to see if she really understands this form thoroughly. And then the last form is also the same. It's so unfortunate because we can see some construction lines, diagonal lines drawn on the board. It would have been really nice to see this as a basis for 2D documentation. But of course, I can only assume that probably they didn't have the time to complete this work. But again, it's a missed opportunity. Also, one way to show the student a process on how process works. If you're going to compare it with another discipline, probably dressmaking, dressmakers would create a pattern, and then the moment the dress is already finished, you can always refer back to the pattern and see how they are related. So this is also showing which designers are more into forms and winging it, and those who are actually understanding the process. And if you are immersing in the process, by now, intuitively, you would know that we are using this enveloping folding envelopes as a spatial organizer. Again, I want to reiterate something when it comes to design criticism. We are criticizing the work and not the person. It's just that as an outside point of view, I also want to point out that when you are presenting your work outside, it is bound for judgment, and it's bound for interpretations, and the work can be very revealing of the amount of thought process and then the quality of time and effort made to make a very quality project. From a more practical point of view, people will say, I'm being trained to be a boss architect. I'm being trained to have staff under me who can draw it easily. Yes, you can do that, but at the same time, who will double check if your staff is doing it the right way? It's not like a mistake on a corner that you can conceal with a cornice. All the lines and all the profiles are very important in this kind of design language. That is why documentation is very important, and even if you are going to be just a supervisor of a design, you will need to understand what's going on. Otherwise, authenticity might get compromised. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time when we go to our next step.